Dean of Food Safety, an unrelenting public health watchdog, he takes great pride in seeing his work come to fruition. Chairman Stupak has left an undeniable mark on this bill through his work on the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee and tireless efforts to fix the problems he has helped identify. Chairman Pallone, who has worked on this issue for over a decade, shepherded this bill through his subcommittee and helped get us to this point today. I'd also want to thank the thoughtful contributions of Representative DeGette and Sutton for their early stages of this process. I also want to thank our Republican colleagues, Ranking Member Barton and Ranking Member Deal, Representative Shimkus. You and your staffs have worked incredibly hard over the last few weeks to bridge gaps, find creative solutions to problems, and help make sure this bill works better for everyone. I appreciate all the efforts and your commitment to keep the food supplies safe. You've helped provide, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that there's no partisan gap when it comes to keeping the food supply safe. The legislation we're marking up represents a huge accomplishment for this committee. We stand on the verge of passing a comprehensive, broadly supported, and bipartisan reform of our nation's food safety laws. We'll see a strong vote out of committee today, and that will send a loud message about the need to move this legislation quickly. I know that we still have work to do, but I'm more confident than ever that we'll soon be able to take this legislation to the floor, and I'm hopeful that before too long we can have a comprehensive food safety bill on President Obama's desk. I want to yield to the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Health, Mr. Deal.
Thank you, Chairman Waxman, and thank you for holding the markup on this bill, the Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009. Certainly having a safe food supply is something that people on both sides of the aisle have as a priority, and I think the markup today will indicate that we have come to a very good agreement in being able to ensure that Food and Drug Administration has the resources and the authority to do what they need to be sure that our food supply is safe for the American people. This committee, I think, deserves great credit for working in a bipartisan fashion. Last week, the Subcommittee on Health did hold a markup on this bill. At that time, various members offered amendments, most of which were withdrawn with the understanding that we would work on those issues before the full committee, and I am pleased to report that that has been done, and the product that we will have before us today is a result of the cooperative efforts of both sides of the aisle and the staffs that have worked to make this bill a reality. I'm looking forward to the markup. I hope that it will be a smooth markup and one in which we can all agree that this bill embodies the safeguards that all of us want for the food supply for our country. And thank you for your efforts and your staff's efforts and your members' efforts, and thanks to the people on my side of the aisle as well and to their staffs for working very diligently on this undertaking. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Deal, and I'll recognize myself next for an opening statement. I'm pleased to be here today to mark up H.R. 2749. Today we take a giant step forward on food safety. For more than a decade, many of us have been focused on the need that has been increasing in importance to protect the health, the safety, and the well-being of consumers with modern food safety standards. We've done tremendous work introducing legislation, collaborating with interest groups to identify the problems, and trying to come up with feasible and effective solutions. We've also done a lot of work in this committee on the issue, and we've had numerous hearings on food safety that highlighted the flaws and shortfalls of our current system. We heard heart-wrenching stories about victims of foodborne illness, including one of a woman who overcame cancer only to succumb to a foodborne illness. We heard testimony from industry experts and consumer advocates, and we heard from the agency responsible for protecting our nation's food supply, the FDA. What we learned and what we believe has been inserted in what is before us today: a food safety bill that will modernize our antiquated food safety laws and catapult the FDA into the global marketplace of the 21st century. This bill will require all food facilities to register with the FDA on an annual basis, providing the agency with an up-to-date list of all the facilities that sell products in the U.S. It will require facilities to pay a registration fee that will be used to help defray the costs of food safety activities as put forth by the bill. The bill emphasizes prevention and safety plans that will help ensure that food is safe when it leaves the factory door and is placed on our grocery store shelves. These controls are crucial in preventing foodborne illness outbreaks and in protecting all Americans. The bill also provides the FDA with necessary enforcement authorities. It creates new and updated civil monetary penalties and criminal penalties. It provides the FDA with recall authority so that when a food is contaminated, the FDA can quickly get that food off the shelves and away from American consumers. And it directs the agency to collect information, conduct a pilot study, and issue regulations on traceability for food that will allow us to rapidly trace a food outbreak back to the source of the contamination. I think we've come a long way from where we started so many years ago, and what we're considering today is very strong. It's a bipartisan piece of legislation that will empower the FDA and improve our food safety system. But a bill like this doesn't happen overnight, and I have to also mention the hard work that my colleagues on both sides of the aisle have put into this bill. Chairman Waxman has dedicated countless hours to the legislation, to seeing it to fruition. Chairman Emeritus Dingell has been working on this issue and this legislation in various renditions for so many years. Mr. Stupak, who has done so much work on the Oversight Subcommittee, held numerous hearings and conducted investigations that were crucial to informing us of the food safety problems. Ms. DeGette has been a champion on traceability and recall and worked closely with us on these key provisions. And I also want to thank my Republican colleagues, Ranking Member Barton, Mr. Deal, and Mr. Shimkus, for their hard work. In the last few weeks, we've really been able to come together on many of the issues, and I'd like to commend the collaborative nature and the constructive tone of those conversations. Thanks to all of us, we have before us today a bipartisan bill that will provide the FDA with the resources and authorities it needs to protect our nation's food supply. And I just want to thank everybody again. And our next opening statement. Who's next? Is Mr. Stearns, the gentleman from Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to thank everybody for the bipartisan effort here. I'm sort of encouraged this morning that we can do this, particularly in light of what's happening on the House floor today. Many of us had amendments we were ready to offer last night at 8:30, 9 o'clock at night, and suddenly they recessed the House, and now all these amendments after the rule presented is not, the rule indicates that out of the 123 amendments, we're down to about 20 amendments. So I'm so glad we can come here and have bipartisanship on this bill. I noticed Chairman Dingell called, Chairman Waxman called Mr. Dingell the Dean of the Food Safety. So the Dean of the Food Safety is a brand new title, Mr. Dingell, that you can carry with you forever now. Americans deserve to have a regulatory system in place that does its utmost to inspect and ensure that the food they purchase to feed their families obviously is safe and affordable. I believe that this committee, after productive bipartisan negotiations, have crafted legislation that will enhance the FDA's food regimen and not cripple the food industry with needless regulation which would drive up the cost of food. By forging a food inspection system that strikes a balance between oversight and personal accountability, it's all of our hope that this legislation will ensure that tainted food never again slips through the public-private safety net that this legislation will institute. I note in the summary of the bill that there is a waiver that farms that sell directly to consumers have to have records, but at the same time open markets that sell vegetables will be able to still do so, pending that they do keep copious records. So I think for those small towns that have on Saturdays where all the farmers come in and sell their produce, they will not be affected, and I think that's good. So I appreciate that allowance which is in the bill. And I hope, Mr. Chairman, that the resources that are required to implement this bill will be provided too. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. You referenced the Dean of Food Safety. Was that the title he gave you, Mr. Dingell? Chairman Dingell is next.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for your kind words. I'm not sure being the dean of anything is particularly good. It seems to me that you're getting old. But I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this markup, and thank Chairman Waxman for his effort and leadership. You will note that there are a number of members who have been the sponsors of this legislation, Mr. Waxman, Mr. Pallone, Mr. Stupak, Ms. DeGette, and Ms. Sutton. But there are a lot of others who have participated in this undergoing, including our good friend Mr. Barton, Mr. Deal, and Mr. Shimkus, and a lot of members on the Republican side. And I want them to know that I'm grateful for it. What we're showing today is that this committee can function in the great traditions, not only of this committee, but of the House, and that we can work together in a bipartisan fashion to achieve important advances in the public interest. We did it last year, as you'll remember, Mr. Chairman, on the consumer product safety legislation, which turned out to be a great piece of legislation, although my colleagues will remember that the Senate meddled around with it just a little bit and caused some complications. I do want to note that we have a considerable measure of appreciation for the participation and kindness of the Grocery Manufacturers Association. Their negotiations in good faith have resulted in us being able to move forward together on the important components of this bill, the first of which are additional enforcement mechanisms and tools available to Food and Drug. And the second are, of course, mechanisms to enable us to fund the operations that have to be taken by Food and Drug, including a very valuable system of registration and other steps which will enable Food and Drug to do the things necessary to assure public safety. I want to commend the staff of the minority, the staff of the majority, and my two staff members, Mr. Virgil Miller and Ms. Katie Campbell, for their hard work on this matter and for what they have done. Mr. Stupak has been a great leader in this matter and what he's done in the subcommittee on investigations and oversight. And you, Mr. Chairman, have been of significant value in your efforts to lead us towards this legislation. I want to quote one of the witnesses who appeared before the Subcommittee on Health earlier this month in a legislative hearing. The Food Safety Enhancement Act is a well-vetted, mature bill. It is also, I'm pleased to note, bipartisan, and we have, as I've indicated, worked together in a remarkable good way to achieve that purpose. It dates back to the first food safety legislation I introduced in 1998, the Imported Food Safety Act. The Food Safety Enhancement Act has been informed by a number of hearings conducted at the Health and Oversight Investigation Subcommittees, the stories of countless victims of contaminated food products, news articles which appear regularly in the press about unsafe imports and major problems with regard to food safety that are affecting the health and well-being of the American people. We've had valuable technical assistance from FDA, and I would just observe what a remarkable difference a new administration makes. We've had technical assistance from consumer, public health, and victim advocacy organizations and the regulated industry. And again, I want to comment on GMA's participation and cooperation. We've also had the valuable and valued input of members of this committee, both Republicans and Democrats. Amongst other things, the legislation we consider today will prevent food safety problems before they occur. The legislation requires foreign and domestic food facilities to have safety plans in place to identify and mitigate hazards. It will increase the frequency of inspections, and it allows FDA to adjust this frequency for low-risk products based on an honest and transparent risk assessment. It provides strong and flexible enforcement tools, including mandatory recall, stronger penalties for bad actors, administrative detention, quarantine, and subpoena authority. It provides FDA tools to ensure imported products into the United States meet our safety standards. And it significantly expands FDA traceback capabilities in the event of an outbreak of foodborne illness, something which my colleagues will note we've had real problems with regard to tomatoes, jalapeno peppers, peanuts, and other things. And most importantly, it generates the resources to support FDA food safety activities. something that this committee is going to have to protect from the fine Italian hands of our beloved friends over there at Appropriations and in the Budget Committee. I want to thank the members of this committee on both sides of the aisle for their patience and their willingness to work with us to address delicate matters. We've tried to satisfy all of our colleagues, and we will continue to work with them to see to it that they're content with the consequences of the legislation. The bill before us is a better piece of legislation because of the collaboration of both sides of the aisle. And I want my colleagues to again know that I look forward to continued discussions as we prepare the bill for the floor. The Food Safety Enhancement Act is a monumental piece of legislation that will go a long way to comforting our consumers and boosting their confidence in the safety of our nation's food supply, particularly stuff coming in from abroad. I will note that as soon as we finish this, we must start on one more little chore, which will relate to the safety of pharmaceuticals. And I look forward to having the same kind of good work and cooperation and goodwill of all of our colleagues on the development of that legislation, upon which I intend to start forthwith. I would urge my colleagues to vote in favor of the substitute, which will be coming up, and I would observe that it is approaching voting age, and that the American people deserve nothing else. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dingell. Gentleman from Kentucky.
Madam Chairman, Madam Chairlady, thank you. And I simply want to express my appreciation to the members and staff on both sides of the aisle in addressing some of the concerns of many members on the original bill. I think, as Chairman Dingell said, the bill is a better bill now and one that will help ensure the food supply of our country, the safety of that food supply. And I look forward to working with all of us as we move the bill toward the floor. I yield back.
Gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for holding this important markup today on H.R. 2749, the Food Safety Enhancement Act. As chairman of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, I, along with Ranking Member Whitfield, Shimkus, and Walden, have held 10 hearings over the last 2 years to examine the safety and security of our nation's food supply. From these 10 hearings, we have learned that the FDA does not have the regulatory tools or financial resources needed to ensure food from domestic and foreign food producers is safe. We also know that the industry has done an inadequate job of regulating itself, as is evident by the numerous food contamination outbreaks that the American people have witnessed over the past 2 years. All signs suggest our government regulatory system does not ensure the safety of the food industry, and it is a broken system which must be corrected. H.R. 2749 takes various steps towards addressing the gaping holes in our nation's food supply by recognizing the food industry and the FDA must share the responsibility for securing the nation's food supply. Provisions granting the FDA additional authorities such as quarantine, recall, subpoena power, and access to records are all addressed in H.R. 2749. These are valuable tools that will aid the FDA when a food outbreak occurs. H.R. 2749 also calls on industry to do more to monitor and prevent contaminated food from entering the food supply. For too long, we have allowed industry to adhere to voluntary guidelines. H.R. 2749 instills accountability by holding industry responsible for the costs associated with the recalls and re-inspections. I want to thank my colleagues and friends, Chairman Dingell, Chairman Pallone, Chairman Waxman, for their hard work on this issue. I also want to thank their staffs who've worked diligently to see this bill come before us today. Their dedication has paid off with a piece of legislation that will help protect and ensure all Americans have access to safe food. I wish to thank Erica Smith of my personal staff for all the work she's put in on this bill to make this markup a reality. I also want to thank Ranking Members Barton, Deal, and Shimkus for their willingness to work with us, not only on this legislation, but also on the numerous food safety hearings and investigations this committee and the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee have held over the past 2 years. I'm proud to be part of such great legislation. I urge all my colleagues to support this legislation. I yield back.
Gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. This is what we can do when we really work together, structurally, deliberately, and I do think it's a model for some even more contentious issues like health care and global warming. But I don't want to shock my colleagues or prejudice them, but I do support the manager's amendment. I know it's shocking. It represents agreements, as been stated, on both sides. Particular parts that I'm very pleased that got in was establishing a risk-based system that gives an inspection regime that gives the FDA the flexibility to change the frequency and inspections for lower-risk facilities, allows the FDA to access to records and information they need to ensure food safety plans are being properly implemented, giving companies the flexibility of using different preventive control systems that work best for them so long as they meet FDA standards. And where things are working, we let existing authority remain with respect to USDA and the oversight of alcohol manufacturers and distributors. Those are just a few details on what this bill does to give FDA the necessary tools and authority to do its job when it comes to the safety of our food supply. Again, Madam Chairman, I support the manager's amendment, and I'm glad that we were all able to work together. I, too, want to thank Chairman Emeritus Dingell, Chairman Pallone, Chairman Waxman, Chairman Stupak, Ranking Members Barton, Deal, and all our staffs. I particularly want to highlight my staff, Chris Sarley, who spent a lot of time with members of your staff, sometimes in good moods, sometimes in bad moods, but I do think we got to a better product, as a lot of people are saying. I look forward to continuing the process in this bipartisan manner as this bill moves out of this committee, and also on equally important legislation should we look to address needs the FDA may have with respect to its authority over drugs, devices, and cosmetics. And with that, I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for holding this important markup today. As a co-sponsor of the Food and Drug Globalization Act of 2009, I'm pleased to see this important food safety measure moving forward. I look forward to addressing drugs and devices later this year as well. I want to commend the work that you have done, Mr. Dingell, Mr. Pallone, and Mr. Stupak, along with our Republican colleagues, on the bipartisan bill we have before us. I'm hopeful that the Senate will work swiftly to complement our efforts so that we may enact this bill into law. If there is any good that came out of the Peanut Corporation of America's salmonella crisis and the series of outbreaks linked to spinach, lettuce, tomatoes, and peppers, it is now clearer than ever that our food safety system is broken and in need of critical reforms. Today, with this legislation, we begin to right those wrongs. An AP poll last year found that 46% of people were scared that they would get sick from tainted food. And there's a reason for this fear. U.S. foodborne illnesses result in 76 million illnesses, hundreds of thousands of hospitalizations, and up to 5,000 deaths each year. As one of the witnesses astutely pointed out in a prior hearing, the Health Subcommittee held on food safety, our nation is sustaining deaths equivalent to those that perished in the World Trade Center attack in New York every 6 months. When you think about it in those terms, it just takes your breath away. And yet, historically, we've set up the FDA to fail. We expect the FDA to ensure the safety of our nation's food supply, but we haven't given it the resources or authority to get the job done. And while there are many food companies and facilities that are employing best practices to preserve their own food products, unfortunately, it's those that don't that cause crippling problems for our public health and economy. That's why it is so important that we pass this bill. By granting FDA the ability to mandate clear preventative controls, strong traceability, and mandatory recalls within their food safety authority, we may finally target the spots along the farm-to-store chain where contamination can occur. This, along with continued and necessary appropriated funds, and I want to emphasize that, continued and necessary appropriated funds, will enable the FDA to finally shore up our food safety system. Madam Chairwoman, the costs of inaction are too great. I am pleased to support the Food Safety Enhancement Act today and urge all my colleagues to do the same, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to thank you and Chairman Waxman, Ranking Member Barton, for all the work that has been done to bring this important issue of food safety before the committee for consideration today. As a representative of the San Joaquin Valley, one of the most productive agricultural regions in the world, I understand the need to provide safe and nutritious food. The growers and producers I represent are dedicated to supplying only the safest fresh fruits and vegetables possible for consumption worldwide. As we have seen with different food safety outbreaks and the Salmonella outbreak last year, a single scare can shut down an entire industry. The Salmonella outbreak in 2008 sickened over 1,400 people and initially focused on tomatoes as the source. However, federal investigators later traced the Salmonella back to peppers from Mexico and not tomatoes, leaving consumers confused and costing the tomato industry hundreds of millions of dollars and calling our food safety standards into question. Given this, I believe that just as each of the various commodities grown in the Central Valley are unique, so should any food safety requirements be commodity specific and tailored to the different levels of risk presented by each commodity. I'm pleased to see the compromises made in this legislation though there are still areas that need improvement. The geographic quarantine sections provides the FDA with large authority to restrict the movement of foods if it prevents a threat. With the traceability requirements mandated, quarantine language that would shut down an entire region should be unnecessary. The unsafe food could be traced back to the producer without punishing other innocent producers, packers, and distributors in the region with the stigma of a quarantine. Additionally, the FDA already has the tools needed, such as public health advisories that would stop the movement of unsafe food without disrupting the industries, devaluing production, or eroding public confidence to the extent that a quarantine would. Adjusting the provision to require an imminent threat before the quarantine authority can be exercised raises the threshold and protects geographical regions from the negative impacts of unnecessary quarantines. I thank the committee for this addition into the geographic quarantine section. As this bill proceeds, I encourage my colleagues to reach out to the farmers and ranchers whose very livelihoods depend on producing the safest food in the world. Keeping them engaged in an open and outgoing dialogue as Congress moves forward is critical to ensure that the law that we create is effective and the compliance is attainable. We must remember that they want safe food just as much as consumers do. As a committee, we have a responsibility to develop the policy that provides Americans with the confidence that they have the safest possible food on their table. I look forward to this markup and again want to thank members for their contribution to this bill. Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I want to thank you for holding this markup on H.R. 2749, the Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009. As a member of both the Health Subcommittee and the Oversight and Investigation Committee, I've been involved in the numerous hearings we've had on food safety issues. We've investigated food contamination incidents in the United States involving spinach, cantaloupes, peanut butter, and tomatoes. Each time Energy and Commerce held a hearing, we found the FDA did not have the resources, funding, manpower, or technology it needs to protect the American food supply and fulfill its mission. In fact, the FDA does not even have the ability to require a mandatory recall, and we have been relying on the voluntary efforts of food manufacturers to ensure safety of their product. There have been several examples of how our food safety system has failed us, and for years we have simply said the FDA is underfunded and we should allocate them more resources. The FDA clearly does need increased funding, and this bill provides some of those funds, and we will have to appropriate more, but I'm happy the Food Safety Enhancement Act finally gets the FDA the authority to improve the systems to protect our food supply. I'm pleased today we'll finally be moving a comprehensive food safety bill out of the committee to full House consideration, and thank you again. I yield back my time.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Upton, is recognized.
I yield back. I'm ready to get started.
Gentleman from Oregon is recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and I congratulate you and others who have worked so hard and diligently on this issue. As you know, our Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee heard testimony on February 11th of this year, probably the 11,000th hearing we've had on this subject, so I'm glad to see legislation moving. Our hearing on the PCA salmonella outbreak included testimony from Peter Hurley of Wilsonville, Oregon. Peter's son, 3-year-old Jacob, became sick in early January, as did a lot of Americans. For about 2 weeks, Peter and his wife watched as his son suffered stomach pain, resulting in vomiting and diarrhea. They took him to the doctor. The doctors couldn't figure out what was wrong with him. So they suggested that he needed to keep some food down, give him the food types that he enjoyed the most. Well, Jacob's favorite food was Austin brand peanut butter crackers, which turned out, tragically, to be the very thing that was poisoning him. Oregon state officials tested 6 packages of the crackers that the Hurleys still had in their home, and 3 of the 6 packages contained salmonella, peanut butter that was contaminated and shipped by PCA. Madam Chair, I think our hearings over the years have shown us that we needed a new and modern and updated FDA. I think this legislation accomplishes that. I know that with any sweeping legislation that adds new inspection regimes and record requirements, we should be diligent in our duty of following it through the process and after it's implemented and make corrections and adjustments where necessary. I want to thank the majority for their work in making this a sound and bipartisan product. And if you're looking for a sexier title for the bill, I suggest we call it Jacob's Law, after Jake, who survived this horrible ordeal. And hopefully no child and no parents will have to suffer this again. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Chair now recognizes herself for 3 minutes. I'm glad to hear that my colleague from Oregon mentioned the Hurley family, because as he will recall, at the end of the last Oversight and Investigations hearing we had this spring, the last of a series that lasted over a number of years, I told Peter Hurley, Jacob's dad, that we would make a commitment to him and his family that we would pass comprehensive food safety legislation this year. And we are. And you know, today, this is the way legislation should go, because we're doing it on a bipartisan basis. We've worked together. We've explored the issues. Everybody's pulled together to make this happen. It almost looks easy, but everybody, particularly on the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, Mr. Stupak and everybody else, we will attest that it was difficult, because when we started this effort 7 years ago, but we had a food safety system in disarray, and it had been in disarray for many years, and it continued in disarray. Story after story, recall after recall. And in those days, it was difficult for us to even convince people that we needed mandatory recall authority for the Food and Drug Administration, much less traceability and some of the other components that are here in this comprehensive bill today. And so it really has been an extraordinary team effort, and that team effort has been directed at one goal: protecting the safety and health of our constituents. We hope that this bill today will give the resources and the powers to the Food and Drug Administration to be able to protect that health and safety, and if there are problems with our food system, to make sure that we can address those problems quickly. That's why I'm particularly pleased that the chairman has worked with me and others to include mandatory recall authority by the FDA in the bill. We hope that we'll be able to catch contamination and avoid contamination before it happens, but if there is contaminated food found, we'll be able to have recall authority. And secondly, I'm so delighted that the FDA will be implementing traceability systems for the entire food agency. We saw this last year with the tomato and then jalapeno recall, where we never really could figure out what was wrong with this salsa. But what we did know was people across the country were being sickened. And what we also knew was that the entire tomato industry was devastated for that year. So traceability is going to help us identify quickly and remove the foods in a targeted way that are causing sickness. I just want to say one last thing. And that is, I have a staff member to thank who's here today, Steve Plevniak. Steve is my food safety maven on my staff. He's been with me for 7 years, just about as long as we've been studying these issues. And he's leaving us to go elsewhere. So this is a fine end for his congressional career. And I just really want to thank Steve and all the staff of the whole committee who have worked so hard on this legislation. And with that, I will now recognize, let's see, who's next? The gentleman from Nebraska.
Thank you. Very quickly, I want to thank everybody involved in this. Like Mr. Pallone, I have a constituent who died of the E. coli in spinach, California spinach. And we've had several other E. coli outbreaks. Amazingly, even though people think of E. coli in meat, it's been salads and sprouts in our district. And it's a delicate balance for Nebraska because we do have agribusiness with lots of facilities, and they will bear some of the cost burdens for modernizing the FDA. But I think this does strike a balance. We need a couple of improvements here, and I will offer an amendment later on that I hope the leadership will work with me on. So I just want to congratulate everybody who's been working on this bill, and particularly the majority for actually accepting some of our recommendations and really working in earnest. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from Illinois.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for this markup. And I want to thank Mr. Waxman and Mr. Dingell, Mr. Pallone, Mr. Stupak, you, Madam Chairman, Ms. Sutton, and those on the minority side who worked with us to craft a really good bill. This is the way that Congress should work. As I mentioned before, this issue is very personal to me. I began my public career working to ensure that food on our store shelves had clear expiration dates at a time when every single thing was secretly coded. And I also have a very dear friend, Nancy Donnelly, who lost her only child, her son Alex, in 1993 after he ate ground beef contaminated with E. coli. My thoughts and my gratitude today go out to her because she turned her tragedy into tireless advocacy for food safety. So we have, as a result of all this work, a strong bill that will strengthen the Food and Drug Administration's ability to keep our food system safe and help prevent some tragedies in the future. It establishes a mandatory recall for the FDA, but the real strengths of the bill, I think, are in its prevention component, stopping an outbreak before tainted food can reach our kitchen tables, requiring all food facilities to implement hazard control plans, to analyze, anticipate, and preempt any point at which a potentially dangerous contaminant could affect a food product. It also increases inspections. Studies have shown that Americans support thorough and frequent inspections of the places where their food comes from. We must maintain, if not strengthen, the timetables for inspections contained in the manager's amendment. The manager's amendment also will implement a requirement that positive test results are reported to the FDA. I think this is a great addition. The agency has to have enough information to know where the problems are. I'm also pleased that at my urging, the manager's amendment includes stronger language on data gathering, sharing, and research into the public health effects of foodborne illness. There's also new language from Mr. Markey calling for reevaluation of the presence of BPA in food and beverage containers. Research indicates that BPA is not safe, and I think Chicago's effort to limit its presence in children's food and beverage containers should be replicated and strengthened at the national level. I think we've made improvements since the Health Committee last week. I think we should continue to examine whether the bill's language is strong enough. I'm going to introduce and offer an amendment that I will later withdraw that deals with the relationship between non-therapeutic antibiotic use in livestock and resistant bacterial infections. I hope that I can work with the committee to deal with this issue in the near future. So I thank you and yield back.
Gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm pleased that we've been able to work together today to address most of the concerns that we had on this side of the aisle during the hearing and some committee markup. Like I've said many times, I believe food safety should be a bipartisan issue,
and I'm glad to see we have made considerable bipartisan progress on this bill. While the bill is not perfect, I believe it will improve FDA's ability to protect our nation's food supply, and it's something I can support. The manager's amendment includes many important changes in the bill, including a more practical inspection schedule, exemptions for farms regulated by USDA, an exemption for alcohol manufacturers already regulated by Treasury, and a more reasonable approach to recall authority and civil monetary penalties. And I hope this experience will be a great guide for this committee on health care reform. Through regular order and bipartisan collaboration, we've reached a very sensible compromise that incorporates good ideas from both sides of the aisle. If we can do this for food legislation, we certainly must be able to do it on a massive overhaul of our health care system. Unfortunately, Republicans haven't even been able to see one word of the health care bill being written by a very few members. Supposedly, we'll see the bill just a few days before we begin a series of hearings, and CBO won't even be able to give it a chance to score the bill before those hearings. We've also been told the Health Subcommittee won't even be given a chance to mark up health care reform legislation due to its artificially rushed timeline. I think certainly the American people and members of this committee deserve better, Madam Chair, and on this issue that will affect every constituent and every family and every business across the United States, I hope that we can find some time to work in a bipartisan manner to get to the same kind of place we did on FDA food legislation. And I would again hope and encourage that we could use this as our template how we move forward and how this body is supposed to operate. And with that, Madam Chair, I congratulate all those involved in today's bill's efforts and would yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Pennsylvania.
I'll waive.
Gentleman from Texas, Mr. Gonzalez. Gentlelady from Wisconsin.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for bringing this bill before our committee for markup this morning. I also want to commend Chairman Waxman, Chairman Pallone, Chairman Stupak, and Chairman Emeritus Dingell for their work in putting this legislation together, and to our friends across the aisle for working with us on key issues of concern. I appreciate the fact that this has been a bipartisan process. In the past few weeks, I have mentioned that I would really like to see increased coordination between the federal government and the states in the area of food safety. And I'm pleased to say that I think that Congress and the FDA agree that in order to meet this rigorous new set of food safety requirements, which I strongly support, we need to work together as much as possible. Once again, I urge the FDA to rely on our extensive network of state-based inspectors and regulators to avoid duplication wherever possible. Another way the FDA can maximize its resources is to utilize experienced third parties. And I'm happy to say that with this new draft, I'm confident that laboratories that currently provide the FDA with much needed support in testing and analysis will be able to continue their very productive partnership moving forward. Like many of my colleagues, I've been inspired by the families that have turned tragedy into action around this issue. When I first entered Congress, I had the opportunity to meet with a remarkable young family. When she was living in Wisconsin, Barbara Kowalczyk lost her young son, Kevin, to food poisoning from meat contaminated with E. coli. She has since founded the Center for Foodborne Illness and has been a tireless advocate for a stronger food safety system. Her mission in life has been to ensure that the same tragedy experienced by her family never happens again. I am so proud of her work, and I hope that this legislation can be a testament to her son's legacy and her tremendous advocacy. Again, thank you to all of my colleagues here who worked so hard on this legislation. I look forward to seeing it passed into law soon. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back her time. Mr. Barton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to submit my formal statement for the record, but just to summarize it, we appreciate the bipartisan effort that's been made on this bill. We appreciate the compromises that have been made. We had concerns at subcommittee about flexibility. The manager's amendment is going to provide some flexibility. We had concerns about the open-endedness of the civil monetary penalty, which we're giving the FDA for the first time. We've reached a compromise on those penalties. that I think is fair and reasonable. And while there are some issues that we want to continue to discuss between now and the floor action, this is a good product. I wanted to commend you, Chairman Pallone, Chairman Dingell, for your efforts, and I want to thank Nathan Deal and the Republicans on my side that have worked to make this day possible. This does show the committee can work together, and we are very supportive of the final product and look forward to taking this spirit of cooperation a step further as we go to the larger issue of health care reform in the next several weeks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Barton. Mr. Matheson.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And while a lot of people have commended the process and where we are right now, I think it's important for all of us to do that because this is a complicated set of issues. And I think that the fact that this committee has worked hard and worked collectively to come up with some consensus, I think that is worth, that's noteworthy, and I commend the chairman for doing that and all other folks. There's so many to thank, I won't name everyone, but I commend the chairman for leadership on this issue. And I'm pleased that this bipartisan agreement's been worked out. I know there are a few issues still to be talked about as it goes to the floor. I have one. And while I'm disappointed we weren't able to work out language to deal with providing a labeling requirement for lead content on ceramic ware, I'm hopeful that we will be able to find some solution to this issue as we go to the floor. It's an issue I've been talking about since 2006, and I'm hoping we can resolve it in this bill, but we seem to have exhausted good options prior to this markup. But I do believe there is an opportunity and we can figure this out. I think the science already tells us what constitutes trace amounts of lead in products, and I think we can work as a committee to direct the FDA to address this issue and issue appropriate guidance. Because at the end of the day, my motivation is consumers should know if they have products that have had a lead glaze put on their ceramic ware. So again, I look forward to continuing to work with the committee. And again, Mr. Chairman, congratulations on moving this bill forward. And I encourage all members of the committee to support the bill. I'll yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Matheson. Mr. Boyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Specifically, I'd like to thank you for accepting an amendment, several amendments, in particular to clarify the bill to ensure that fisheries are included in the definition of farms, which are exempt under the tracking and trace requirements under Section 107. I had offered the fisheries amendment on behalf of Congressman Gresham Barrett of South Carolina, who is very concerned with regard to those of whom seek clams, the oysters, the shrimpers, and the fishermen in the low country of South Carolina. And as he thought about that, he also then thought about the coastal plains all around the boundaries of our country. And I want to thank Mr. Pallone, who also has a congressional district, and so he understands the sea and the importance of this amendment to the fishing industry and agreeing that they should be treated in the same regard as the farmers when it comes to direct sales from farms. I think this amendment will help ensure that they're not subject to unnecessary regulatory burdens and will save many of the small businesses in our nation's coastal communities. Additionally, I want to thank you for, and also Mr. Dingell, for working with us on an amendment to ensure that the primary responsibility regulating the alcohol industry remains in the hands of the Tax and Trade Bureau. I hope we've arrived at an agreement that's acceptable to the alcohol beverage industry and ensures that the stringent oversight of the TTB remains in place. I believe the TTB has done a good job ensuring the safety of alcoholic beverages in our country, and I do not think it is in the best interest of this committee to interfere with the memorandum of understanding struck between FDA and TTB, which has operated very well for many years. I'm also pleased that the user fees had dropped to $500 per facility. These user fees can significantly impact small businesses, and so I want to extend my appreciation for that. I'm also encouraged by the movement to address the concerns about FDA regulations on our farms and specifically for their impact on livestock and poultry producers. The livestock and poultry operations already carry many of the requirements of this food safety bill, such as record keeping and inspection activities. While the language is not perfect, I would agree that we worked hard to reach a consensus, And we should also, as we work with our friends in the Senate, make sure that we're not duplicative, especially with regard to regulations. And we should also remember, let's not make the exception the rule. A vast majority of food processing companies in America are operating above and beyond any of the food safety requirements, and their hazard risk assessment plans go further, and we should recognize that and be careful, as I said, about making the exception the rule. The last comment I would make, Mr. Chairman, is it's when we finish this, it's off to the drug safety bill, and I'm pleased to work with Chairman Dingell, and I think that the Bouyer-Matheson bill on electronic pedigree for drugs, if you like what's happened here on the tracing requirements for food, you're going to love what Mr. Matheson and I have been able to come up with drug pedigree. And Chairman Dingell and Chairman Waxman, I want to thank you and look forward to working with you on the drug safety bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Boyer. Mr. Markey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. I rise in support of this bill, and I want to commend you and Mr. Pallone, along with Mr. Barton and Mr. Deal, for the bipartisan way and the extensive work which has been done on this important legislation. I also want to thank each of you and others for working with me to include language related to the safety of BPA in food and beverage containers. The language that is included in the bill calls on FDA to evaluate the approved uses of BPA in food and beverage containers and to tell the committee whether each use is safe by the end of the year. If FDA finds that BPA isn't safe, it is additionally directed to tell us how it plans to protect public health, which could include banning the chemical as well as efforts such as placing warning labels on products that contain it. As you know, BPA is a ubiquitous chemical found in most food and beverage cans and many reusable plastic containers. It was also found in most baby bottles until recently, when major baby bottle manufacturers agreed to voluntarily stop using it because of concerns about its effect on health, which are many. BPA can be linked to increases in breast and prostate cancer risk, heart disease, liver abnormalities, and diabetes. BPA can result in adverse impacts to reproductive health. BPA can be linked to increase in obesity, attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, brain damage, altered immune function, and other problems. BPA can be found at dramatically higher levels in infants than in the rest of the population and is also found in placental tissue and umbilical cord blood, and BPA has been found at higher levels in women with a history of repeated spontaneous miscarriages. Not all industries are as receptive to addressing health concerns as the baby bottle manufacturers were. In fact, just recently, the food and packaging industry convened a meeting in Washington at which they devised an expensive public relations campaign to claim that there is not really a problem. So I am glad that we've been able to work together in order to construct something which I think is a very good way to approach the issue. I once again thank all concerned, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Markey. Mr. Pitt?
I'll waive.
Mr. Pitt waives. Mr. Burgess?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And this is an important subject that's before us this morning. It does appear that the cake has already been baked, irrespective of substance, style, or practicality. And I understand and appreciate the political calculations which have been made in order to produce in less than 2 weeks a discussion draft, a bill, convene a subcommittee mark, and now a full committee mark, all in the interest of food safety. But much like the idea of health care reform, where the concept of health care is universally agreed upon, giving our constituents safe food is also non-controversial. Food should be safe. But the devil still is in the details, and not all the details here are completely agreeable. While there has been considerable conversation about the substance of the bill, there are aspects that are of concern. In the past, I've spoken about the need to have a way to halt imports so that when a foodborne illness issue arises on the border on Friday afternoon at 4 p.m., we don't have to wait until Monday morning for someone to make the decision to stop the importation of said food. To deal with this problem, I've introduced legislation dealing with the Imported Food Safety Improvement Act, and I hope to see that language added to this bill as an amendment. Also, while I note improvements have been made to the civil monetary penalties for violations of this act, and we heard Ranking Member Barton speak to this, right now, there's no differentiation made for those who are neither considered an individual or a company. Most food manufacturers are either a small business or a very small business, and yet, whether the intent was intentional or unintentional, because they are not a single-man operation, these very small businesses could potentially be hit with a fine as large as $1 million, even though their annual earnings may only be a fraction of that. Just as this committee has recognized the need for scale in the amount of penalties for the individual versus the company, we need to recognize the need for scale in the amount of penalties for these very small businesses and the companies. Furthermore, the timeline for inspection is problematic. The Food and Drug Administration has repeatedly stated that they do not have the inspectors, and in fact, they've just recently delivered to us data that underscores that fact, nor do they even have all of the contracts with third-party inspectors to meet the expectations of this bill. That's not an excuse for non-performance. We all know that they've been underfunded and under-resourced. I think this is a very real and calculated analysis of their assets, and the Food and Drug Administration simply does not have the human capital to do what we are going to ask them to do. We must give them a reasonable amount of time to ramp up inspections, and it strikes me that 18 months does not meet the standard of reasonableness in this situation. I do not want the Food and Drug Administration to be back at yet another oversight and investigation hearing to discuss how they did not meet with the expectation demands of the bill. I want us to fix the inspection problems this time and not continue to deal with it as an ongoing problem. I support the inspection requirements of Senator Kennedy's Food Safety Modernization Act, as well as those put forward by Mr. Costa. Reasonable in schedule and rationale for inspections is needed. And then just finally, as probably been mentioned several times this morning, we got an amendment in the nature of a substitute of 133 pages just before this markup started. It's not identical to the language of the bill, and as a result of the negotiations going on between the two sides. However appreciative I may be of the consideration of the conversation, I'm troubled members not being given enough time to read these 133 pages and ensure that all of the contingencies have been met. I'm sure the substance of this food safety conversation should allow ample opportunity for members to make their review, and we should expect nothing less. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the consideration. I'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Burgess. Ms. Matsui, do you wish to make an opening statement?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend you for your hard work on this essential legislation. I'd also like to compliment my colleagues, Mr. Dingell, Mr. Pallone, and Mr. Stupak, on their contributions to this critical bill, and also the hard work by Ms. DeGette and Ms. Sutton. Mr. Chairman, my hometown of Sacramento has had a rich heritage of agriculture. Although Sacramento is now an urban area, there are rural areas surrounding it that produce rice, walnut, almonds, tomatoes, and grapes. And as Mr. Radonovich, my colleague on the other side of the aisle, knows, I was raised on a farm in Central California, which he now represents. My family raised grapes, plums, peaches, and nectarines. I am now mostly a consumer, but I really do have a fine appreciation about the challenges facing agriculture. And I also have 2 toddler grandchildren who just love to eat. So I'm well aware of how critical it is for our food supply to be safe. If people get sick from food on their tables, they lose confidence in entire aspects of our economy. When E. coli was found in California spinach 3 years ago, the spinach industry lost hundreds of millions of dollars. Not one, not the spinach industry, not the restaurant industry, not the American consumer, and certainly not this committee wants to see this happen again. Agriculture made my home state of California what it is today, but it did so because people had confidence that food and produce from California is safe to eat. We must restore confidence in our food safety system, Mr. Chairman, and that is why I support today's legislation so strongly. The bill before us today strikes a good balance. It protects the consumers who sit down to dinner with their families tonight and eat a meal that they have a right to know is safe. It also acknowledges that agriculture and food industries are essential to our economic health. I'm pleased that the legislation dramatically increases the resources available for the FDA to carry out its critical mission of protecting our food supply. We've known that the FDA has had a resources problem for a long time, and today's bill resolves that issue. Mr. Chairman, I commend you for all that you have done to ensure that the food in my constituents is safe and healthy. I urge my colleagues to support the Food Safety Enhancement Act, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Matsui. Mr. Scalise.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the bipartisan approach that's been taken on the food safety bill. Obviously, this is an issue I think we can all find agreement on. It was unfortunate we weren't able to achieve that level of bipartisanship during the cap and trade energy tax debate. But hopefully as we go forward in the days ahead and begin debating the important issue of health care, this same bipartisan approach could be taken as we on this side present our solutions to reforming our nation's health care system. Look forward to those debates and look forward to completing this markup today. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Ms. Christensen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just briefly, I'm glad to see that this important bill is before us today. It's a good day for public health and for the health promotion and protection of the American people. I just want to take this opportunity to applaud you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Barton, and the subcommittee chairs and ranking members, many of our colleagues, including and especially our Chair Emeritus, Mr. Dingell, for the work that has gone into creating this bipartisan bill, and I look forward to passing it today and soon on the floor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mr. Space.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to begin by commending the important work that you and Chairman Dingell, Chairman Pallone, Chairman Stupak, Representatives DeGette, and of course my colleague from the state of Ohio, Representative Sutton, have done on this legislation. This bill is the product of extensive hearings and negotiations that predate my time on the committee, and I truly appreciate the work that you've done. I also want to thank the bill's authors for taking into consideration the perspective of affected industries in crafting this legislation. I represent an extensive agricultural sector, and the changes made to the original discussion draft are very much appreciated. In particular, I want to thank the chairman for working with the livestock industry to ensure that this legislation works in a logical fashion with their interests. I commend your work as well as the work of that industry to reach consensus on a challenging issue. What is at stake in today's discussion is the safety of the food available to consumers. Earlier this year, a bad actor in the market knowingly distributed a flawed product to American consumers, leading to well-publicized health consequences. While this particular actor is not representative of an industry that is generally both safe and responsible, the incident highlighted areas of our nation's system of food safety that needed improvement. I applaud the authors of the bill for making these improvements and making the food available to our consumers safe. In particular, I applaud the chairman for working to establish systems that encourage individual actors to be both accountable and responsible. By requiring individual facilities to develop their own, more thorough safety plans, I believe we have moved toward a system that will effectively protect American consumers. And I'd also like to commend the leadership of both the chairman and the ranking member in working toward a bipartisan compromise. I believe that the work done on this issue can be a model for this committee in working towards bipartisan consensus on challenging issues. I'm hopeful we can continue to work in a similar fashion on other issues in this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Space. Mr. Barrow?
I thank the chair. I want to commend all the good work of Chairman Waxman and Pallone and Dingell and Stupak and all of the staff members who contributed to this. As we all know, some bad actors in my state are a big part of the reason why we're sitting here today working on this legislation. The worst of it is that these folks hurt and killed a lot of Americans as a result of their willful misconduct, but that wasn't the extent of it. A lot of perfectly innocent bystanders got hurt too. The economic impact wasn't confined. It affected a lot of people, processors and farmers, who are doing the right thing by the American consumer. I'm pleased to call attention to the fact that the manager's amendment essentially amends the underlying act in a way that I think makes a big step toward addressing the problems we found out about in that instance. One of the things we found out is that these folks had positive results of tainted food that they were putting into the marketplace. They knew that they had tainted goods they were putting in the marketplace. They kept on sampling until they found a clean batch and kept on testing until they got a negative test result. What they were doing is they were shopping around and continuing to look for negative test results, false negatives that would cover up the evidence they had of the true positives of tainted food they were putting into the food supply. That really gets my goat, and there's something we can and ought to do about it. One of the things I put on the table from the beginning about this process is to explore ways and means of putting a mandate to report positive test results in real time, so the folks don't have the option of shopping around for false positives and the option of sitting on the true positives that they got, but they have to divulge the information so that we know what they know when they know it. I'm pleased that the bill has been amended essentially in ways that can address this problem. What it does essentially is it requires that the food safety plan, that's a new mandate, describe the testing regime that all the registrants are going to have, and also it mandates the FDA to conduct a pilot program to see how a mandatory reporting regime might actually work, because one of the things we brought out on the hearing is this is a whole lot easier said than done. You can have a whole lot of unintended consequences that can cause folks to basically want to dumb down their testing, not to know the things that they need to know, and that's something we don't want to have happen. So I'm very pleased that these two approaches are going to reflect, I think it's the first step in the direction of mandatory positive test resulting. We want to see how it works. And I want to commend, again, all the staff and the folks who had a hand in it. What I think this will allow us to do is to help pick the bad actors out of the pack before they can do harm and help us spot problems real early on before they get out of control. With that, Mr. Chairman, I thank you again for your leadership on this. I want to thank the stakeholders for working with us on this to understand all aspects of this approach. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Barrow. Mr. Gingrey.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I want to thank you for holding this markup today on H.R. 2749, the Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009. I also want to take the time to commend you, Ranking Member Barton, Health Subcommittee Chairman Pallone, and Ranking Member Deal for moving this legislation through regular order and for working in a bipartisan way to bring critically important food safety legislation before the committee. Unfortunately, there have been a number of failures in our food safety system over the past several years that range from the E. coli contamination of the California spinach to that incidence of salmonella-tainted peanuts from the Peanut Corporation of America. Unfortunately, some of that in my home state of Georgia. Clearly, we need to take proactive steps to better protect the health and welfare of all of our citizens when it comes to the food that they eat on a daily basis. So, Mr. Chairman, during the subcommittee markup on this legislation last week, we discussed and debated a number of concerns that were raised by members, not for the sake of political gain, but for the sake of creating sound policy that will help improve the legislation. To that end, I commend my colleagues in the majority for working with me and accepting an amendment that I think will greatly improve this legislation by recognizing the balance that the Food and Drug Administration has with USDA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, when it comes to food safety. Mr. Chairman, the language that has been accepted, and I thank you, provides a clear distinction through statutory language that allows both the USDA to continue using its expertise in inspecting facilities, especially when it comes to livestock, and the FDA to focus on the areas of food safety where that agency can excel. This language mirrors the companion legislation that is being considered in the Senate, and it codifies a collaboration between FDA and USDA that should exist for our farmers and our livestock producers. So I am pleased that this provision was able to be included in the bill, and I'm encouraged that this was one of the many items where partisan politics were able to be put aside for the benefit of the American people. In the coming weeks, we will be debating comprehensive health care reform. It's my ultimate hope that we can come together, much like we have done on food safety today, and work in the best interests of American people on that issue like we are doing this morning. Again, Mr. Chairman, I commend you for working diligently with me and with my Republican colleagues to improve this important legislation. I look forward to our continued spirit of comity on H.R. 2749 as it moves to the House floor, and I yield back the balance of my 16 seconds.
Thank you, Mr. Gingrey. Ms. Eshoo?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll just be brief. I want to start out, I think the way everyone else has, to congratulate the members that have worked so hard on this and made this markup possible. Certainly yourself, Mr. Pallone, the Chairman Emeritus, Mr. Stupak, members from the other side of the aisle working to work this out, because it's so critical to people in our country. I also want to salute the consumer organizations who have been obviously the conscience in this, and you are essential. You have been essential. You will continue to be, and I want to salute you on this. As I mentioned in the previous hearing, this issue had to mature in order to have us all arrive at this point today, to do a food safety bill. Unfortunately, there had to be catastrophic happenings in the country. And as I said, I had introduced legislation going back to 1997 with the new senator who had just left the House, Dick Durbin. But nonetheless, today is an important date, and I think this bipartisan consensus speaks very well about our seriousness to address the huge shortfalls in our food system. I'm still an advocate for separate food and drug agencies. I think today, obviously, is a very, very important step that we're taking. And I think that this committee should monitor the impact of the legislation and FDA's capacity to carry out these reforms. If, in fact, they don't have the resources that we are counting on, then this legislation will not be able to be carried out. It's too serious to let it fall amongst those rocks. But today is important. I congratulate and I thank everyone that's been a part of it, and I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Mr. Melanson?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll waive my opening.
Then the chair would call on Ms. Sutton. Oh, Mr. McNerney, you're ahead in seniority. Excuse me.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for bringing this legislation forward. This is a personal issue to me. I had a daughter that suffered an E. coli infection, and as a parent, it was very difficult to watch my daughter suffer possible kidney failure and even death. It was 5 days before we even knew what caused the infection. So this is incredibly important. I understand the pain that families go through that suffer these kinds of infections. I also represent San Joaquin Valley, which has a tremendous number of producers and food processors, and I understand the need to have regulations in place that that aren't overburdensome and protect the producers, the legitimate producers, from the bad actors. It seems that this bill manages to balance those two needs of protecting the consumers and not overburdening the suppliers. It's a good bipartisan effort. I'm proud that we've been able to accomplish this, and I urge my colleagues to support the bill. With that, I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. McNerney. Ms. Blackburn?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will waive my opening and look forward to continuing to work on the bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Inslee?
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for including my amendment to clarify the intent behind the authority given to the Secretary to quarantine geographic regions of the country. Limiting the authority of the Secretary to quarantine any geographic area no greater than is appropriate to protect public health will not only protect the American people, but will help safeguard the industry that the American people rely on for safe food. I think it was an appropriate thing to do. I also want to just express relief that we are finally adopting measures on leafy green vegetables that have been successful in the meat industry. I believe they're going to have great effect. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Sutton?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for holding this markup on this critical legislation. I'm proud to be a sponsor. I want to thank all on both sides of the aisle who have been working on this bill, and specifically, Mr. Chairman, you and Chairman Pallone, Chairman Emeritus Dingell, Chairman Stupak and Congresswoman DeGette for all of their hard work and long dedication, along with Representative Schakowsky, to this issue. And I am delighted that we're one step closer to passage of this bill. And I do want to especially thank Mr. Dingell for his leadership on this legislation and for the inclusion of the mandatory recall provision that I introduced as the Protect Consumers Act for having been included in this bill. I am very grateful for that. I join all of you, Chairman Waxman, and others who have spoken in our eagerness to see this bill reach the floor for passage. We have seen the headlines over foodborne illnesses repeated in our national press, and we've seen too many outbreaks of these illnesses, and they've highlighted the vulnerability of our food supply and the need for safety reform. The issue of food safety and foodborne illnesses, I've repeated here in this committee, has taken a disproportionate toll on the state of Ohio. And over the past year, there have been 105 cases of salmonella infection reported in Ohio, and sadly 3 deaths from the most recent based peanut strain. Among the 3 who sadly lost their lives was Nellie Napier, who was a constituent of mine, and she died from salmonella poisoning, which she contracted in a nursing facility. And I had the opportunity to meet with Nellie's sons and talk to them about the devastating loss of their mother. And of course it would be devastating in any way to lose one's mother, but the fact that she died from eating peanut butter was excruciating for them. You know, it's our obligation to protect our most vulnerable populations. And as I mentioned in Ohio, just in April of this year in Cuyahoga County, there were 3 incidences of illness from E. coli, and we had another death, this time a 7-year-old girl. So it is critical that we are taking these steps today to ensure that the FDA is doing all that it can to protect our families and ensure our food safety. It's why I introduced the mandatory recall legislation for the FDA in the first place, because Americans need to know that the food on their family's table and in their children's lunchboxes is safe to eat. And whether it's grown here or it's imported from abroad, there must be strict regulation of the supply line that feeds our nation. And in this bill, we've also taken aim at the safety of imports. And from our hearings, we learned that close to 13% of the food that we eat comes from abroad, and yet the FDA inspects less than 1% of the food shipments arriving at our ports. And this dynamic needs to change. And so the certification provisions in this bill we're marking up today will help with the safety of food imports, and this is something that we need to continue to work on. Mr. Chairman, I look forward to working with you and all of my colleagues to pass this legislation out of the full committee and move it to the House floor. And I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Sutton. Mr. Braley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Food safety is something that affects every American, and that's why it's so important that today you are demonstrating leadership by leading us forward on a markup of this bill. I'm supportive of the bill because I know it's going to address many of FDA's shortcomings, and I've had the opportunity to follow this through a number of hearings, both in the Health and the Oversight and Investigation subcommittees. I'm confident that this bill will take steps to prevent future illness and death due to unsafe food products. And I also want to thank the committee for its hard work to address my concerns relating to the treatment of carbon monoxide in food packaging, and I'm pleased to see a positive resolution of that issue. In addition, the committee has been very responsive to my concerns over the treatment of farms in this bill. I've maintained that we need to ensure coordination among all government agencies involved in food tracing and farm inspections, and we don't want to create duplicative requirements on farmers. I work closely with Representatives Butterfield, Space, and others to come up with compromise language which will ensure that the food and facilities are exempt from this act if they have already similar regulation under USDA. The committee has worked with us, and I'm glad to see that the manager's amendment today exempts USDA-regulated farms and facilities. I support strong oversight of food products and facilities, and I'm glad we're making sure that our government agencies are coordinating and avoiding duplicative regulations. So thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I'm confident this Food Safety Enhancement Act will take significant steps to ensure the safety of the food we eat.
Any other member wish to make an opening statement? If not, the chair would like to recognize Mr. Dingell.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your courtesy. Today, Mr. Chairman, this committee is losing a very valuable servant. Today is the last day, and the last day before retirement of our good friend Ray Kent, who has served as deputy clerk of this committee since August of 1979. Almost everybody on the committee and on the staff knows Ray and knows what a wonderful, valuable, faithful servant he has been to the public interest, and to the members of the committee. We are going to miss him. He is going to be hard to replace, but on behalf of all of my colleagues here and on behalf of the committee, I would like to first thank Ray Kent for his extraordinary public service, both in terms of length and in terms of quality, but also to wish him well on behalf of the committee, to congratulate him and to hope that his retirement is long, successful, and happy. And I thank you for that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Dingell. I want to join with you in paying tribute and thanking Ray Kent for his service, and I'd like to ask the members to join with me in giving him a round of applause. We have completed the opening statements on H.R. 2749, the Food Safety Enhancement Act of 2009. I would like to ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. And without objection, that'll be the order. I have an amendment at the desk in the nature of a substitute. And without objection, this amendment will be considered as read and open to amendment at any point as well. This amendment reflects the extensive bipartisan negotiations we've had on this bill over the last couple of weeks. It also makes several important changes to respond to the various concerns stakeholders have raised about the bill. I'll just mention a few of the major changes. The language now makes clear that the bill applies to FDA-regulated farms and facilities. The amendment clarifies the ways in which the bill applies and does not apply to facilities manufacturing alcoholic beverages. Those facilities must register but do not have to pay a fee. It also clarifies that the ways in which the Secretary of the Treasury currently regulates alcoholic beverages will not be impacted by this bill. In the area of preventive food safety plans, the amendment clarifies that FDA must permit the use of alternative preventive controls that are demonstrated to effectively address the hazard. The amendment clarifies that FDA has the authority to require finished product testing at high-risk facilities if FDA finds that such testing or reporting would bring about useful risk information. Before doing so, FDA must complete 2 or more pilot projects and a feasibility study. The amendment makes some important clarifications related to FDA's access to records by describing the situations in which FDA may access such records remotely. Among other changes, the amendment also strengthens the provisions related to the surveillance for foodborne illnesses, includes a bipartisan compromise regarding civil monetary penalties. The amendment clarifies that importers must pay a $500 annual registration fee, just like the other registered facilities are required to do in the bill. The amendment responds to concerns we've heard about duplicative regulation of customs brokers by the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. Under the revised version, customs brokers would only be required to register with FDA, but will not have to pay a fee, nor will they be subject to any good importer practices. In response to the need for new inspectors, the amendment adds a new section that would require the Secretary to support and provide assistance to establish and maintain one or more university-affiliated protection training institutes that conduct training related to food protection activities for federal, state, local, territorial, and tribal officials. And finally, I want to acknowledge the work by Mr. Markey in addressing public health concerns about BPA in bottles and food packaging. FDA told the committee in legislative hearings that they're working to assess the risks of BPA. The amendment incorporates language by Mr. Markey that will require FDA to report back to the committee on their findings, and if they find a risk, take appropriate actions to address it. I'd like to now call on members who seek recognition for purposes of offering any amendments. Gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Terry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk. It is Terry only, not 1, 2, 3, or 10. Waive the reading.
Clerk reports the amendment. The gentleman asked unanimous consent to waive the reading, and he's now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I first want to apologize for my tardiness. This didn't come to my attention until just the last few days. But working with agribusiness in Nebraska and food manufacturers in Nebraska, I've learned that on page 12, line 9, where we exempt the storage of the grain or commodities on the farm from the FDA inspection. But what agribusiness typically does, if you're a cereal maker or whatever you're buying the grain, you'll contract for the grain that's on the bin on the farm for delivery at a certain time in the future. What happens because, and needs clarifying then, because of that contract, the ownership technically by contract has changed from the farmer to whoever contracted for it for a future delivery. And now under this bill, when you read it as it's written, then whoever contracted that grain, even though it's still in the bin on the farm, they have to go through the licensing or permitting and $500. And there's a lot of bins with grain stored on it in Nebraska. That could lead to hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars. And I think that was kind of an unintended consequence of the language, so this fixes that problem. And with that, I would like to yield my time to the chairman to ask if I would draw, could I count on being able to continue to work with this and see if we can fix this, what I perceive as more of a technical issue. Yield to the good chairman.
Thank you very much for yielding to me. I appreciate your drawing this issue to our attention. I can see how it may seem unfair that because a farm is acting as a storage facility for raw agricultural commodities, other than that from its own farm, it's no longer exempt from the registration requirements of the bill. But we have to look to see whether this is, in effect, having the farm act as a warehouse or silo. I appreciate your concerns, and I certainly want to pledge to you that we'll continue to talk to you and see if we can work out these issues.
With that assurance that we can continue to talk and hopefully work at this out, I will respectfully withdraw my amendment.
Gentleman withdraws his amendment. Are there further amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? Mr. Matheson. Without objection, the Matheson amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman's recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. I mentioned in my opening statement this issue about trying to somehow get more information to consumers so they are aware that there may be lead in the glazing on ceramic ware. There's a problem that was first manifested that I learned about in my district of a mother whose baby was ill. They discovered it was lead poisoning. It was because she was eating food off of the plates that she used in her microwave, and then through nursing the baby was exposed to lead. This is a more complicated issue than I originally thought. I will withdraw this amendment in the interest of trying to move towards where we can build consensus on how to perhaps address this issue. And Mr. Chairman, with that, I will just yield back my time or yield to you. But I hope we can find some way to get around this issue.
I thank you for bringing up the amendment and for withdrawing it. I want to work with you on it. You've raised a serious matter.
Okay, I'll yield back.
The amendment's withdrawn. Further amendments?
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Dingell.
I seek recognition, strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman's recognized.
This is just really to engage, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, to engage in a colloquy. The gentleman from Utah has been more than gracious on this matter. This is not a new problem, and he's absolutely right in catching it. It's been around here since I had hair. And it's been a terrible problem, and I'm going to suggest to the gentleman that I would like to work with him on it. And I'm also going to suggest to him that we probably ought to begin by a letter to both Food and Drug and CPSC, asking their technical assistance on how this matter should be addressed. Very frankly, the problem that the gentleman wisely points to is a serious one. It relates to the leaching of lead from ceramics into food products. And I'm not quite sure how Food and Drug addresses this, but if they can't, by the great horn spoon, we'll see if CPSC can. So I want to thank the gentleman for his kindness in withdrawing, and I want him to know I intend to work with him.
Thank you.
And I'll be in touch with him about necessary communications to the two agencies.
Thank you.
And I thank you and yield back the balance of my time.
Further amendments to the legislation. Ms. Schakowsky.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentlelady is recognized to explain her amendment.
This amendment would require the FDA to end the non-therapeutic use of antibiotics in livestock that are contributing to increasing prevalence of antibiotic-resistant diseases. Foodborne illnesses are now becoming more difficult to treat due to the increase in antibiotic-resistant strains and the decreased effectiveness of antibiotics routinely used as a first-line defense. 2 million Americans acquire bacterial infections during their hospital stay every year, and 70% of their infections will be resistant to the drugs commonly used to treat them. In fact, resistant bacterial infections increase healthcare costs by $4 billion to $5 billion each year. A contributing factor to this rise in antibiotic resistance is the routine feeding of important human antibiotics like penicillin, tetracycline, and ciprofloxacin to food animals. 7 classes of antibiotics certified by the Food and Drug Administration as highly or critically important in human medicine are used in agriculture as animal feed additives. Many factory farms give these antibiotics in the daily feeds to cows, chickens, and pigs not to treat disease, but to promote growth, improve feed efficiency, and to compensate for overcrowding and bad sanitation. These classes of antibiotics are among the most critically important in our arsenal of defense against potentially fatal human diseases. Approximately 70% of antibiotics and related drugs produced in the U.S. are given to cattle, pigs, and chickens to promote growth and compensate for crowded, unsanitary, stressful conditions. This kind of habitual, non-therapeutic use of antibiotics has been conclusively linked to a growing number of incidents of antimicrobial resistant infections in humans and may be contaminating groundwater with resistant bacteria in rural areas. University of Illinois researchers found in 2001 and 2007 that routine tetracycline used at hog farms was contaminating groundwater with tetracycline-resistant bacteria, which through gene transfer were sharing resistance with other bacteria. The researchers concluded, quote, groundwater may be a potential source of antibiotic resistance in the food chain, unquote. The Illinois Department of Health calculates that the incidence of one type of resistant bacteria, methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, or MRSA, has risen nearly 57% to over 10,000 cases in just 4 years. We should be addressing food safety from farm to fork, including practices in food animal production like routine antibiotic use that can make our food less safe to eat. Reducing antibiotic resistance could save billions of dollars each year in health care costs. Mr. Chairman, I will be withdrawing my amendment, but I hope this committee will examine this very important issue in the near future. I yield back.
Well, if the gentlelady yield to me, I share your concern, and we're not able to work out this issue in this bill because it's contentious, and we can't reach a consensus on it before this markup. But I want to emphasize, however, that addressing antibiotic resistance remains a priority for me. Antibiotic resistance poses a real and growing threat to our nation's ability to fight life-threatening diseases. And I want to tell you that we'll continue to work toward a solution in this committee.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Are there further amendments to the legislation? Yes, Mr. Space.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered as read, and the gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'd like to first state that I do plan to withdraw this amendment. However, I believe it's important to raise an issue that concerns many of the farmers that I represent, and that is the safety of their proprietary information. I would again reiterate my thanks and commendation to the work for the work of the authors of this legislation and for working to address the concerns of the agricultural industry in the draft. I understand it's not the intent of the authors to make the proprietary information of America's farmers widely available to the public under this legislation. I'm hopeful that the authors of the legislation will be willing to work with me to place safeguards in the legislation to ensure that the information is not made available widespread to the public. Now you're back.
If the gentleman would permit, I'll certainly be pleased to talk to you further about it. I think the bill went a long way to deal with this issue, but we should be open to further discussions. Thank you. The gentleman
Thank you, Mr.
withdraws his amendment. Are there further amendments to the legislation? If not, the vote now comes on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor of the amendment in the nature of a substitute say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the amendment's agreed to. Now the vote will come on H.R. 2749 as forwarded by the subcommittee, as amended by the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor of reporting out H.R. 2749 as amended, please say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, no. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. The bill is reported out of committee. That concludes our business. I thank the members for their participation and their willingness to work together. We stand adjourned.